So good morning all. Thanks very much for attending. We've got a wealth of knowledge on this panel today. We've got an issuer with Teck resources. We've got two international global standards from, I'm going to say TSM from the standard point of view, and ICMM. And we've got a sell-side analyst, a leading, I think, award-winning sell-side analyst. So it's a very, very important panel, this, simply because the industry is being led, really, and is being formed and formulated with ESG and sustainability at the heart of it. I was at a conference, the FT Mining Conference the other day, where there was on the ESG panel, where in fact might as well not have had it because the other 19 panels all included ESG at the heart of it and sustainability at the heart of it. And the huge expansion we're going to see to meet the electrification of the future is going to be dominant. Is going to have sustainability as the dominant theme as part of that. So I'm Jamie Strauss. I run a company called Digbee, which is an ESG accreditor for the mining industry. And as I say, I'm honoured to have this esteemed panel today. So I'm going to start off maybe just with a brief introduction from each of you, and then we'll get stuck in. So why don't I start at the end?
Great. Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right, we're awake. I'm Photinie Koutsavlis, Vice President of Economic Affairs and Climate Change at the Mining Association of Canada. I joined the team in June of this year, so I'm just up my 6-month mark. And prior to being at the Mining Association of Canada, I was actually a public servant for 26 years and worked at Natural Resources Canada in the lands and minerals sector. So I've had the experience of seeing public policy being developed with respect to mining industry, and now I have the opportunity to be on the dark side or the light side and actually having exposure and experiences at the operating level and with our member companies. So really enjoying being able to pull those two pieces together and bring some value added, I'd say, advice and recommendations to the industry itself. So thank you for including me in this panel, and it's some great other panelists here that I'm being joined with.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Fedosenko. I'm the Director of ESG Engagement with Teck. Teck is a leading Canadian mining company producing copper, zinc, and steel-making coal, with operations in Canada, the United States, and Chile. And we just recently, about 4 weeks ago, opened an office here in London, or at least 4 weeks ago is when I arrived. So I'm super excited to be here. Just come from Vancouver. I've been with Teck for about 10 years, working on ESG reporting, ESG integration, and now more recently on engagement. Prior to joining Teck, I was a freelance writer, primarily working with NGOs in Australia.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Aidan, Davy. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at ICMM. It's a pleasure to be here, to see so many familiar faces. And I guess ICMM, if I were to sort of summarize it in a sentence, it's an organization that exists to promote responsible business practices within the mining and metals sector. My background is as an environmental scientist, but after a decade or so doing that, I lost my way, went into social performance. I've worked in international development, but have been at the ICMM for 15 years, and I've led on various portfolios during that time.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Chigumira. I head up the EMEA Metals and Mining team on the sell side at Suisse. So very much a traditional bottom-up sell-side research analyst. However, over the past 3 or 4 years, I've been integrating also bottom-up forward-looking ESG analysis into my offering as well. And so that's why I'm here today.
Thank you very much indeed. So I want to start off the first question, which is a bit pronounced, but was Elon Musk correct to say ESG ratings made no sense? Now let's get a bit of background for those of you who don't know what happened, but Tesla effectively was pulled out of the S&P rankings based on issues such as racial discrimination, lack of low carbon strategy and business conduct. And at the same time, I think it was 6 different oil and gas companies came into the sector, and he took a little bit of a dislike to that. So was he right? And Katie, I'm going to come to you first, because as an operator, it really is a very pronounced question, this. And it's, I think the evolution of ESG and sustainability is complex for most people to understand, and the detail of this. So perhaps from your perspective as an operator, maybe you start off and I'll come to the others afterwards.
It's super interesting to see the evolution. So I began in the ESG disclosure team at Teck in 2015. And around that time, we were responding to 5 ratings and rankings. And when I left to work with our internal technology team in 2020, we were responding to 29. And it's just incredible to see the amount of stakeholder, in particular shareholder interest in ESG. And I think what a lot of ratings and rankings focused on when you're filling out hundreds of pages of data in a team of first 1 and then in the end 5, which you can see how much work there is behind it, you see that they really focus on what I like to call operational ESG. So what are the material issues not only for your organization, but for the sites where you're operating, and providing that really granular level of detail on the amount of water used, how many Indigenous people are at your operations, what's your track record on human rights. And so when it comes to operational ESG, it's not just about what you produce, but how you produce it that's becoming increasingly important. I think that's exactly what Tesla experienced, because of course they are leading us into a great future with their really, I think, promoting the use of electric vehicles in a way that no one anticipated. However, we want to hold them to account, same way that we're held to account as a mining company, to do it in the most responsible way possible.
Okay, and Photinie, from a different perspective, from your position, do you feel as though with regards to where Tesla was coming from, do you feel as the way they interrogated the different standards and the way S&P was going, do you think that was right? Do you think he was right to shout out about this?
Well, I think ESG standards, it's driven by predominantly, 2 streams. So you have investors who are seeking to understand what they're investing in, and is their investment being undertaken in companies that, like Teck, have very high sustainability standards. And then you also have consumers that are driving that narrative where they want products that they purchase, electric vehicles that they are able to acquire, that are undertaken once again with the highest sustainability standards. So I'll turn it to Aidan in a moment in terms of all the various standards that we have out in the ecosystem right now. But in order to be able to achieve that, that sustainability imperative, we have to be ensuring that the data that we're collecting and that we're reporting against is actually, accurate enough at the site level to make an absolute difference in terms of those decisions that are made.
Okay. Aidan, would you agree?
So I've got to go back to Elon,
Yep.
because, with typical understatement, what he actually said at the time was, ESG is a scam. It's been weaponized by phony social justice warriors. And so I think he managed to insult many, many different groups of peoples in that statement, which is perhaps, part of the great skill and art that he has when he takes to Twitter. But setting aside the fact that some sort of thought, well, look, this is just sort of the ramblings of an entitled man-child, I think there is a more serious concern with the statement in and of itself, because I think the problem is that what Musk did was that he conflated ESG, which is fundamentally a framework for the assessment of risk from an investment perspective, with the good that companies may do through their core business offering, or the positive impacts that companies may have. And look, as somebody who's been active in the mining sector for a considerable period of time, much as I would love to see a much more balanced assessment of both the potential impacts of investments, both from an adverse perspective, with the positive contribution that companies can make. And if you think about mining, it can make extraordinarily positive contributions. But I think it betrays a basic misunderstanding of ESG as it's reflected in the investment risk management frameworks that investors use. Now, yes, I think that's problematic. I think we do need to look at a more balanced perspective, but we're not there today.
I think we're going to come to some of that, because I think that's a really important. There are so many different users within the ESG space that it's sometimes difficult to understand how this evolution is effectively impacting the different stakeholders and who's using it. And so, Danielle, maybe I'll just come on to you with that Elon Musk thought in your mind, but from a perspective of an analyst. trying to incorporate ESG metrics into this. Was Elon right to say that from his perspective? And how would you like to see, and moving on to my next question is, how would you like to see some of the data evolving so that you can effectively use it more simply, frankly? Because whether it's your company or whether it's Goldman Sachs or whether it's anybody else, how can you, if everybody's going to be different, it's going to be very, very difficult for the analyst community to be able to come out with consistency in the approach so that companies can effectively work to good.
So resisting the temptation to dunk on Elon Musk, which is really easy. I think what the comments betrayed is a really narrow focus, like some of my panelists have already said, on a particular stream of ESG, and that is, what is the end product that you're producing? How helpful is that for decarbonisation? And on that single metric, right, clearly Tesla would look better than oil companies. However, that narrow focus on one of many aspects of ESG, I think, is one of the downfalls of the way that people look at it. And in extremis, taken to its logical extreme, if you were to stick to that kind of evaluation, it would lead to investment conclusions that would starve the sector of capital and then ultimately undermine the whole decarbonisation task, because clearly the products of mining are needed in order to decarbonise. So in terms of what the companies can do to help us evaluate ESG from a broad perspective, I think a lot of that progress has already been made. So the approach that I take, which is relatively unique among my competitors, this is what investors tell me, is to look across from a holistic perspective, what are the different elements of E and S and G that we care about within the sector? What are the positives? What are the negatives? What are the forward-looking metrics that we can look at? And what are the backward-looking metrics? And also to look at ESG from a perspective that bakes in the understanding of how the sector actually works. And I think that some of the issues that we have in terms of the current status quo is that the traditional providers of that ESG research, who are all sector generalists, they only do half of that equation, right? So they only look at the negatives, they're looking exclusively backward-looking, and because they don't understand the sector, they make some predictable, from my perspective, systematic errors in terms of evaluating how these companies look like relative to each other. And so I think that we've already come a large way from the perspective of company disclosure. I've seen in the time that I've been writing about this topic more proactively rather than reactively, right? As in, you have Brumadinho and everyone goes and writes about tailings. And I'm trying to write about it from a proactive perspective. I've already seen the quantum and the volume of the data that the companies produce increase massively. And I think where the missing element is a common way of understanding how that data should be evaluated in order to come to some more logical and understandable conclusions.
So I guess that from a sector point of view, I think that's really exciting, because I think a lot of people would say that the mining industry is many, many years ahead of many other sectors with regards to ESG. It's been, to all intents and purposes, been incorporated within business plans for the last 20 or 30 years, in perhaps not across the whole spectrum, but in many different areas. So what you're really saying is sector-specific data will become very helpful, not just from the analytical community, but from many other different stakeholders as well.
Absolutely, and I think that, there are elements of data which have been produced consistently for much longer than I've been looking at the sector, which is only just over a decade. But I've seen greater responsiveness from the sector in terms of trying to give a greater sense of the underlying performance on an operational level and supplying the data that allows us to evaluate that. So one very specific example is thinking about like mining operations in area of water scarcity, right? So initially when I was trying to evaluate this, I'd have to go like mine by mine, figure out where the mine is it in a basin, in an area that's water scarce? Is a company using potable water in an area that is water scarce? And all of this was a very bottom-up, arduous process, right? That is unreasonable, I think, to expect a fund manager to do, or even to expect a Sustainalytics to do, because how are they going to do that across thousands of companies? And so when I was doing this analysis in 2019, I would have to do that from the bottom up. And now there are several companies that just give me that number, which is immensely useful, right? So it helps to elucidate that particular issue with some helpful data.
Interesting. And Katie, let me just come back to you. What are your customers are saying? Ultimately, they're the end result, I suppose, of where ESG is ultimately going. They need to make sure that their underlying product is meeting their requirements. So what are they looking for in terms of being able to access this data or assess this data?
I'll respond to that, but I first wanted to give another example in terms of Danielle's comments there, where we're, I think, really seeing a lot of operational specific data and nuance coming through. And what we're finding is that people are asking all the way to specific components in an operation. I got a question recently, what's the carbon intensity of that new crusher at QB2, our new copper project in Chile? I was shocked. That level of granularity is getting more and more significant. And when it comes to what our customers are looking for, they're looking for evidence. But the big thing I'm hearing from our customers, and frankly, in ESG more broadly, is prove it. Show me the data, show me the evidence. And the big evidence they often will look for is ICMM performance expectations assurance, MAC TSM standard, or we see more commodity-specific standards coming down the pipe in terms of customer acceptance, in particular copper mark, and more recently zinc and moly mark. And so every customer has slightly different needs, but typically they're looking for third-party verification of an accredited standard based on excellent ESG data to more and more granular levels. And they're looking for that because their customers are looking for it. The downstream automotive manufacturers, back to Tesla again.
So Photinie and Aidan, how can both of your organizations help Katie and ultimately Danielle? How can you both kind of help bring that forward or take that further forward to ultimately ensure that this evolution brings out a result?
I could kick first. So Katie mentioned towards sustainable mining, and I'm happy to chat about that in a later part of our conversation. And there's a number of protocols that we have within that standard, and it's driving operational performance and improvement on various social, economic, and environmental practices. And what's very interesting about this standard is that it's done at the site level. So it's not aggregated at a company level, but at the site level where it means more to communities, where it provides the data and evidence to communities, as well as investors and consumers in terms of the performance of that particular company in that particular community. And the purpose for the standard, for the various protocols, and there's principles that drive operational performance. So it's not only about what you've done well this year or what you have not done well this year, but it also provides guidance and the operational, I would say, support in terms of how you could improve your operations at that site level. So it actually provides companies with the opportunity to grow and better themselves in areas that they've had challenges in with that support as well. So it gives that confidence to investors in terms of the legitimacy of the data and evidence at the company level, at the site level, at a particular community. It gives certainty as well as information to community members in terms of what's happening in their backyard to be able to have those projects go forward and be able to be productive. But it also gives companies the opportunity to work with us in terms of various protocols to help them grow and be able to improve their operations. So it really is a very strong ecosystem of working with partners to be able to, once again, at the site level, increase and improve their operational performance.
Yeah, maybe just picking up on that. So it's interesting. I guess the data demands, the information needs of the customers of Teck's products, say, versus Danielle, they're very, very different. And so if you are a downstream customer and you want to know about the metal that you're purchasing from a particular company, typically you're much more interested in the means of production and the quality of management than you are necessarily in quantitative data. And so I think that's where, whether it's the Mining Association of Canada's TSM or ICMM's mining principles come into being, because the ICMM mining principles lay out good practice, environmental, social governance standards for what good looks like when it comes to the management of a whole host of really complex issues at an asset level. And that's something that customers are critically concerned about, wider society, a broader set of stakeholders are really concerned about. So informationally, that's really relevant to that group. When it comes to investors, and particularly rating agencies, typically they're much more interested in quantitative information. They're less concerned and less exercised by quality of management. Again, I think that's a mistake. And to Danielle's point, I think increasingly they're also looking for data disaggregation on an asset-by-asset basis. And part of the challenge with that is that you can as a company provide asset-by-asset data, whether it's on water or on human rights or whatever else. But the challenge is that very often that information is pretty meaningless without context. Mm-hmm. And so there is a sense that data times analysis equals insight. Well, not necessarily when it comes to ESG data that's uncoupled from context.
So that brings me on to an interesting point. It's something I'm very passionate about, and I know, Danielle, you bring on this. So the great means to communicate at the moment on an ESG basis is through the global ratings agencies. And the global ratings agencies, I think, have a fairly bad press with regards to how they've been addressing ESG generically, not specifically for the mining, but the mining industry, there's a huge issue. I think there's a lack of consistency. There's been quite a lot of inaccuracies as a result of algorithms effectively not reading perhaps the nuance of the mining industry in the way that, maybe we'd like to, but also I think just the complexity of the sector. So is it fit for purpose? And I think from the audience point of view, there's so many different bits and pieces which fit into this, because you've got these guys coming down from here, but you've got all of these different global standards which are trying to effectively be assessed at the top. So it is complex, it is evolving. Is it fit for purpose? And how can we, maybe the panel's got any ideas as to how we can effectively try and move this forward to come up with better solutions. Danielle, maybe I'll start with you, because I know this is an area that you're quite passionate about and you do see some evolution here. Maybe you start off.
Sure, thank you. So I would say as a bit of context, the reason that I started to write and analyze ESG more from a bottom-up perspective was a result of the frustrations that the investors that I talked to had, and I think still have, with those rating agencies who were approaching ESG analysis on the mining sector and just fundamentally not understanding it, right? So as to give a tangible example, I think the conversation has moved on a bit, but when you are endeavoring to look at intensity metrics, so emissions intensity, water intensity, tailings intensity, some external rating agencies still use revenue as a denominator. And that's understandable because you can pull revenues from Bloomberg and easily build an algorithm to calculate intensity on that basis. But in a sector that is cyclical like ours, it makes absolutely zero sense. And you end up with conclusions that also, unsurprisingly, don't make much sense. And so I think that there has been some improvements, both in terms of the quality of the underlying data and the analysis thereof. But based on the conversations that I have with investors who are obviously my primary client, there is still a gap between what the outputs are from those global rating agencies and the kind of assessment that they're having to make, even not an ESG-specific fund, just a normal mining fund. The ESG hurdles that they have to clear in order to invest in a mining company cannot be satisfied with the analysis that they get from global rating agencies. And that creates a great opportunity for me in the middle, right? But from a top-down perspective, it is not a great position to be in for the sector overall. And so I do think that that's something that is evolving and continues to evolve. To make a point around the lack of consistency in terms of conclusions from global rating agencies, I know there is a breadth of opinions here on the panel, but I would say from my perspective, the lack of consistency isn't in and of itself an issue, I think. Yeah. I think that if the different agencies are trying to measure different things, so say Sustainalytics is more risk-focused and MSCI is more emissions-focused, or whatever the case might be, it would make sense in that context for the outputs of that analysis to be different. I think the problem is that the robustness of the analysis is not there. And that's really where the problem is, rather than the outcomes being different. Because I do a role where I have a buy on a stock and another analyst has a sell on a stock, and both of us could have very robust reasons why we believe that. So that's how I think about the rating agencies at the moment.
So you touched there on some of the kind of basic analysis or the basic premise right at the beginning, but do you feel as though the algorithms are getting the right data? Is that one of the underlying problems? If we could get more specific, nuanced data and get that up into the algorithms, is that something which effectively allows then the whole process of algorithms and ultimately to work more effectively and therefore greater confidence in it? Because at the end of the day, it comes down to confidence in the sector. If we as a sector cannot encourage confidence in the sector, then we're not going to attract new pools of capital who have a huge reputational risk with regards to mining. And we need to be able to get over that. So what are the, and I'm interested also from others, maybe Danielle, I know you're probably keen to say something, but then I'll go to maybe Katie afterwards, but Danielle, just finish up on that.
Yeah, I'll just make one final point. So I saw a meta-analysis about a year ago, again, trying to get at what are the reasons why different rating agencies have different conclusions around ESG. And the conclusion from that meta-analysis is that the vast majority of that difference between different rating agencies can be explained by the different rating agencies measuring different things. Right? Not what I suggested earlier, that one rating agency has a greater weighting on one group of data and another on a different group of data. Fundamentally, they're measuring different things. Right? So that's, as a starting point, again, it's part of the reason why I think that it's not currently fit for purpose, because there are clearly a range of things that are important for the sector, so there shouldn't be stark differences between what the different rating agencies are measuring. That's where I'd leave it.
Katie, any further comments?
I think there definitely has been an increased amount of completeness among ratings and rankings. It was a huge part of my role to make sure that the information was accurate and fully represented our performance, good, bad, or otherwise. I think that the big opportunity is to be a lot more forward-looking in terms of their analysis, and to also have them contemplate not only the lagging indicators that are common for assessing performance, for example, in health and safety, and ICMM has an excellent annual health and safety survey that complements the ratings and rankings. You typically will look at lost time injury frequency, or LTIF. Those are about events that have already happened, whereas management on a monthly basis is looking at high potential risk or high potential incident frequency. They're looking ahead to understand what those events might be that could potentially seriously injure or kill someone, and then implement controls to avoid them. We don't see metrics like HPIF being used by ratings and rankings. We see them by sophisticated investors. But I think there is an opportunity for collaboration for management to share what the smaller set of ESG metrics are that they look at on a frequent basis, what the overall stakeholders are looking at, and finding that sweet spot. I don't think that we need more ESG data. We need more context, and then determining what's meaningful in terms of assessing a company's future performance and being transparent about their current status.
Okay. Aidan,
Yeah, so just to come in on this one, I guess I see it as being a little bit more problematic than Danielle, and I guess I go back to the basic purpose of what is it that the rating agencies are trying to support. And so, if we think about asset managers taking the ratings that are coming out of the rating agencies, they're using it to do two things. They're using it to construct, actively or passively managed funds based on ESG criteria, or they're using it to support integration of ESG into the investment decision-making process. And the challenge is that if you've got these widely varying ratings that are coming through, then or ratings which don't really, kind of compare terribly well to one another, that becomes problematic, because how can you have confidence in the judgments that are being made on the basis of that data? And just to unpack that slightly, if you compare credit risk ratings versus ESG ratings, massive spread in terms of the differentials between the different rating providers. And I accept, credit risk rating, more straightforward. You're looking at likelihood of default as opposed to ESG, which is a broader thing. But still, there's been several really good academic pieces that have come out in the last couple of years comparing the ratings between different ESG rating providers, and we're seeing a spread of or coefficients of correlation less than 0.5, very often significantly less than 0.5. So at best, we're seeing a really weak to moderate relationship between those ratings. Compare and contrast that with the ratings from the traditional credit ratings providers, where we're seeing coefficients of correlation approaching 1, so a perfect kind of match between them. And again, Danielle's pointed to one of the reasons for that, because on the one hand, they're using much fewer data points for credit ratings. They're data points that have been derived through financial reporting, where we've seen a degree of kind of convergence over multiple decades. Whereas in the ESG space, different reporting standards, different reporting approaches, different data that's going into the analysis. And I guess if you've got a really sophisticated investor who's looking at this and interrogating it and has the informed knowledge in the way that, say, you have, to say, these are measuring very different things, that's fine. But in reality, when you look at many of the PRI signatories, they're taking this to support the investment decision-making process. They're not discerning, they're not making those differentiated judgments. And if they're just buying data from a single provider, they may come out with a very different conclusion than they would were they to go to a different data provider. And I think that is intrinsically problematic.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to jump on in question for Tina. I'm going to come to you. I mean, it's an easy question to ask. I think it's almost an impossible question to answer. Which are the key ESG standards and methodologies that miners should follow and why? And let's be absolutely honest, there are lots of global standards. And there are some of them which do not complement each other. I mean, GRI is one on one hand, ICMM, as we're represented here, and then equally you've got things like the cyanide code, and they're very different purposes. So how do you answer that? And how do we help mining companies know what to disclose from that point of view in order for them either to receive better valuations or ultimately access capital?
Well, I'm a little biased in terms of which standard should be the preferred standard by mining companies, and I think I'd likely be fired if I didn't talk about towards sustainable mining from the Mining Association of Canada. And I just want to back it up a little bit in terms of context, and I know that I'm preaching to the converted within this room in terms of the foundational value of the mining industry in terms of decarbonization and reaching climate goals and the inputs it is to electric vehicles, to solar panels, to other clean technologies. So the imperative is a lot clearer now over the last number of years in terms of the value proposition that this industry brings to a global context. And let me talk a little bit about the Canadian mining industry as well. And we do have a very strong, as I mentioned, value proposition in terms of the plentiful resources, skilled workforce, robust transportation networks, the agreements as well as relationships we have with Indigenous communities that are in approximate distance to our mining operations. And there is definitely tax incentives, and I could go on and on and on in terms of why you'd want to do business in Canada. However, and I'm going to pick up a point that Katie made earlier, it's not the what we do that makes the difference, but it's the how we do it that sets us apart from many of our competitors globally. And that's where I'd like to chat a little bit about towards sustainable mining for those in the room that might not be as aware of it, because it is definitely a backbone to the Canadian mining industry. So towards sustainable mining, or TSM, which you'll likely be hearing quite often over the next number of days, it was originally created in 2004, and it was really to drive performance improvement across a range of social and environmental issues, as I mentioned earlier, where it mattered the most, which was at the site level. And this focus on mine site performance makes TSM a go-to system for investors and manufacturers. I know we picked on Tesla a little bit, but like Tesla, and also look to invest in purchases that are responsibly mined materials. So TSM is a mandatory component for all of our members. So Teck being one of our members, they do have to report against our TSM standard. And it really holds companies accountable in critical areas of the mining process. So that's including climate change, Indigenous engagement, biodiversity conservation, water stewardship, tailings management, and much more. So it really is that entire economic, social, environmental ecosystem. What's really interesting about TSM is that it's been adopted globally. It's been adopted in 11 other mining associations, so that's 6 continents and over 200 companies around the world. And then most recently adopted by Guatemala, which is a country that has struggled with mining and had many challenges and at times violent conflicts. So, and also what's interesting about TSM is that there's also a community of interest panel that works around the standard. So it isn't the mining industry talking about the mining industry. It's a multi-interested interest panel with, we have Indigenous representatives, we have community representatives, we have ENGO representatives, we do have industry representatives, we have labor representatives as well that look at the standard in terms from their own particular expertise and perspectives in terms of how do we make sure the standard is representative of the industry, is able to feed into the data points where others are looking for in terms of ESG standards, whether it's investors, whether it's consumers, whether it's communities as well. So really that third sort of like party panel keeps us honest at the same time, which is very important for the industry as well as for others to understand that it is not simply the mining industry, promoting the mining industry with this brand or logo, that it actually does have a foundation in terms of the areas that are of interest from those that are experts within it as well. So to answer your question, Jamie, it is a very plentiful ecosystem of standards, and it's almost a double-edged sword. Everybody wants to report against everything, and at the same time, now how many standards that you have to report against at Teck, it ends up being a lot of a heavy burden for companies operating in the space who want to do right and good and be able to demonstrate they are doing their work sustainably, but having to possibly fill out and be able to provide data to 5, 6, 7, 29 standards is quite cumbersome. And there is the ability within TSM where, I can't say that word, but where there's equivalency, interoperability across a number of standards. And I think that's also the work that many within this area are becoming much more aware of is there that one standard down the road that we all could rally around and have as a silver bullet in terms of reporting against. And I'll turn it back to you, Jamie, and I'm sure Aidan has some thoughts around convergence as well. But it's definitely a very busy space, but I think the intent is there to be able to try to streamline that space as much as possible.
Thank you for that segue, because I was going to literally just come on as kind of final questions to you, and I would love to get one question from the audience if we get time in this last few minutes. Is what, in terms of correlation, in terms of consolidation, collaboration, what do you think can be done going forward? Taking Photinie on from your comments there, but Katie, how can issuers help in further collaboration and consolidation of this to make it effectively easier on management teams to effectively do the work that needs to be done in terms of not only reporting but ultimately on the ground as well, and then communicate? What, from an issuer's point of view, what can be done? And then Aidan and then Danielle, I'll leave it to you finally at the end, because you're the one who then reads all the data at the end of it. But Katie.
I think about two key themes, and the first is on integration, and the second is on what I like to think about as radical transparency. So from an integration standpoint, we've been operating for 107 years. We want to operate for another 107, and a big part of that is opening our arms to these different standards, and it's a lot for our sites. It's about 2 or 3 management days for 4, 5, 6 standards a year. And so 2 years ago, we started doing an integrated assurance process. I know it's quite a technical thing to share, but it's actually really transforming how we think about being able to respond to these changing expectations. And now that we have a solid baseline, when we contemplate, for example, adopting the zinc mark, it's about adding it to our existing process and understanding the great equivalencies, many of which are already clearly articulated between ICMM and MAC and Copper Mark and a number of others. So continuing down that path internally and externally. On radical transparency, into a conversation we were having before, I think there's a lot more openness I hear among our senior management to admit when we don't have all the answers, when we don't fully understand a data set, and to really embrace that radical transparency, to share that with our stakeholders and invite them to collaborate on solving these common issues, because not being able to manage a type of Scope 3 emissions is not unique to Teck. And so I think we have an opportunity to collaborate on a path forward there.
Aidan, bearing in mind the time we've got limited, but do you want to add some further comments on
So really quickly, I guess there's a simplification, convergence in the reporting space. That's going to come about to a degree fairly naturally, because with the advent of the International Sustainability Standards Board and their memorandum of understanding with GRI, I think we're going to see an increasing kind of simplification of the reporting landscape. Yeah. When it comes to the standards landscape, there again is one of the kind of, if you like, the competing standards in this space. We would say ICMM's running principles are great, but we feel an obligation as sort of part of the contribution to complexity in this space to simplify. So we are, as an organization, deeply committed to the notion of convergence between responsible mining standards. That's a long-term project. We're certainly actively in discussion with other standard owners, and we think that there is a way that we can simplify the landscape, which has huge benefits both in terms of the companies who are ultimately responsible for implementation, for downstream customers in terms of what is it that we're actually getting when we subscribe to a particular standard, and indeed for wider stakeholders who again are somewhat confused by the complexity that we've created through the multiplicity of responsible mining standards we currently have.
Danielle, all the comments, are they going to make your life easier?
Absolutely, and and just a couple of final points, I guess. I think there are a few areas in which greater data is needed, but one of them is definitely around biodiversity. Right? What does natural capital accounting mean? What does that look like? So that's an area in which we need greater data. However, especially with the data that we already have, that we already use and analyze, to reiterate a point that Katie made earlier, is that companies being more transparent around this suite of emissions, we know exactly how we're going to decarbonize them and how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. And this suite of emissions, we have very little idea now, and we're not even sure that our starting point of measurement is accurate. And so that degree of transparency, to make it clear the things that are easy and the things that are hard in terms of adapting the industry to operate in a more sustainable way, I think would engender a lot more confidence from an analyst perspective and from an investor perspective as well, in terms of the companies having a realistic understanding of how difficult it is to adapt the industry for the future.
Brilliant. Well, I think in summary, unless I've got one specific question, I think from my point of view, this is evolving. It's evolving quite quickly. It is improving. It's getting better. We need to see more future-looking data. I think we need to see more context, particularly from the mining industry, from what you're saying. Clearly, there's an improvement of transparency going on within the mining companies themselves, and I think that's a big leap, which is moving forward, which we're seeing. And ultimately, we need to then communicate that in a credible way so that all the different stakeholders, not just the investors, but all the different stakeholders can use it, and management can use it internally to further their progress towards what good means, and therefore be part of society in a far better way. So that's certainly what I've got out of it. I'm really grateful for all of your deep thoughts and everything on that, and I really appreciate it. Without being I'm being told no questions. So I'm sorry about that, but thank you very much indeed, and thank you to our panel.